For the past several years, officials in Boston have been working on responses to climate change, most notably in areas directly affected by rising sea levels. The city recently came out with reports updating its strategies for coastal resilience in parts of downtown Boston, the North End and Dorchester. To tell us about the reports is the Climate Resilience Program Coordinator for the City of Boston, Peyton Siler-Jones. Thank you very much for being with us, Peyton.
Yeah, my pleasure, Chris.
Peyton, I want to have you start with the climate change, not that we're going to be experiencing decades from now, but what is happening currently in Boston. What can you point to?
Yeah, so when we talk about climate change in Boston, we're really talking about four things. And as you've already said, we can really see those things already happening today. So there's sea level rise, there's more frequent and more severe coastal storms, increased precipitation, and extreme heat. And I think the two big ones that we're already really seeing today are the sea level rise and the extreme heat. So many Bostonians are familiar with flooding at Long Wharf, along Morrissey Boulevard. We're also experiencing hotter days. I mean, here in November, we just had a couple of 70-degree days. So climate change isn't something that's unknown or abstract to Bostonians. It's really happening now, but of course, we'll continue to see changes in the coming decades.
Well, right now, if you have the tides overflowing at Long Wharf, you see some pictures on Universal Hub, and people say, "Oh, isn't that interesting?" But there's more than just something interesting going on there. What do you see in what's happening now, and what might be happening even in just a few years from now?
Yeah, so I mean, we see overtopping along the Harbor Walk and along the bulkheads. And we recently put out a coastal resilience solutions report for North End and downtown, which really looks at what needs to change in those really specific flood pathways over time to continue to protect the neighborhood. So at Long Wharf, for example, we're looking at protection along the edge of the wharf. So maybe it's elevating the Harbor Walk, maybe it's some offshore outboard solutions. And the report really lays out a number of opportunities that we can look into.
Well, the other thing I'm going to have you tease out a little bit is resilience, because you can't stop the sea levels from rising. So you got to learn to live with that in a way. So what does that mean?
Yeah, so I think our kind of working definition of resilience on the Climate Ready Boston team is both the ability to withstand climate change, so withstand a storm event, for example, but also how quickly can you bounce back from that event? If we do have flooding, how able are we to kind of quickly bounce back after that? And we also kind of think of resilience in these two buckets. There's like physical resilience of our infrastructure and of our built environment, but there's also social resilience. Are Bostonians really prepared for the impacts of climate change over time? So our team really thinks about both of those kind of key pillars of resilience.
Well, in the near term, there are some physical changes involved with some of the park and playground space in the North End. What are you doing there?
Yeah, so you may have already seen in Langone and Popolo Park, the back edge of both of those parks is being elevated in sort of a normal capital improvement upgrade to the park. It's being elevated to protect through 2050, which is about 21 inches of sea level rise. So, and over time, we plan to adapt that landscape berm to provide full flood protection in 2070 and beyond. So that's already happening today. We have some budget in our improvement cycle for Christopher Columbus Park to also elevate the back edge of that park. So really activating and utilizing those open spaces where possible in the North End downtown. Of course, you know, there's less open space opportunities there than there may be in Dorchester, for example.
Yeah, and what about Dorchester? Because you got a serious problem on Morrissey Boulevard. Even when you don't have a storm, you've got some high tides that just shut down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is state-owned land. So a really important takeaway of the Climate Ready Dorchester report is collaboration and sort of an all hands on deck approach is critically important to the success of climate resilience in the neighborhood. And that's true across our neighborhoods. But the Climate Ready Dorchester report presented basically two main options for protecting Morrissey in the long term. The first is elevating Morrissey itself to be protected to the design flood elevation, which basically just means where you physically need the flood protection to be out of the flood zone. And the alternative for Morrissey was adding kind of a landscape berm wrapping around the edge of Morrissey, which would provide that flood protection. So it's kind of a two-option approach.
It sounds almost tame, but isn't this like a big dig in reverse?
It feels a little different. I mean, I don't know much about the big dig. I wasn't working in Boston at the time, but it's different in a lot of ways. But certainly they're similar in that they're both, you know, huge infrastructure projects and will require a lot of coordination and collaboration.
What's also interesting in Dorchester is at the same time you have these safeguards and resilience items put in, you're also thinking about extending the Neponset River Trail that's used primarily for bikes and, you know, pedestrians. You've got more public access going on. How does that work together with the resilience and the safeguards?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the real benefits of resilience that we talk about a lot in all of our reports is that there's opportunity to provide that connection to the waterfront that maybe hasn't been there before. So when we think about landscape berms or adding a boardwalk or a harbor walk, yes, all of those solutions, as you're saying, absolutely provide the physical flood protection, but they're also activating that connection to the waterfront. And that's something we talked a lot about with residents who are inland, sort of on the other side of I-93 and Morrissey Boulevard in Dorchester. Like what are solutions that would make you want to spend more time on the waterfront? And that's absolutely what we prioritized in the process.
Well, spending time sounds like recreation, but I'm thinking of that trail also as a transportation route because you've got all that growth being planned for the Columbia Point Peninsula. Isn't that part of the solution to getting people there without tying up traffic somewhere else?
Yeah, that's a great point. And obviously, a lot of the real heavy transportation thinking is happening at BTD, Boston Transportation Department, through their Go Boston 2030 implementation. Obviously, BPDA considers that as well. But that's something we heard a lot in the open houses and during the planning process, that transportation is a high priority for Boston residents. And so a lot of our solutions do tie into the priorities that are being led by other departments.
You've already mentioned the need to coordinate with the state, and that has been an issue for decades too. But at the same time, when I'm looking at the cost of all these adaptations going into the future, isn't this more than just the state and the city or even the federal government? Are there other partners that are going to have to pitch in?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as I said before, it's a really all hands on deck approach. And the state and the Fed, everyone has been really an incredible partner in this work so far. But also, you know, there's private lands on the waterfront. And so working with homeowners, residents, developers to think about how do we get that full district scale protection for Boston is critically important and something we've been doing and will absolutely continue to prioritize.
Now, I know these reports are updates and extensions of work that's been going on for quite a while, but are there any other takeaways do you think people should be aware of?
So one of, I think, the most exciting takeaways from the reports is around this idea of nature-based resilience solutions. So living shorelines, sort of protecting and enhancing existing natural resources. And in the Neponset wetlands area of Dorchester, our flood modeling showed us that the sort of marsh restoration and health strategies that we included in the report are also really effective in protecting the neighborhood from sea level rise. And so that was a big win for the mayor's Resilient Boston Harbor vision, which prioritizes those kind of green nature-based solutions. So that's a really exciting takeaway, I think, from my perspective.
We should mention that if people want to find out more about these resilience plans as they progress in the future, you get a place online where they can go to for that?
Absolutely, yeah. Boston.gov/environment is a good landing page, and then Climate Ready Boston has a pretty clear program page within that. And on our page, we talk about opportunities to get involved, what we're planning, how implementation is going. So there's a ton of information there. And as I mentioned, you know, Zoe and I are both working on this, as well as our other colleagues, Sanjay, Allison, Carl. We're all always happy to talk to residents about what we're doing, how they can get involved. So definitely check out the website, but also reach out to us directly.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks, Chris. It was a pleasure.
That was Peyton Siler-Jones from the city's Climate Resilience Program. We'll have more news in just a moment.